Okay, hello everyone. So welcome to the chess fundamentals class. Uh, my name is Dipankar, and let me tell you a little bit about myself at the start before we begin and start talking about the chess content. So you can see basically what we are going to be talking about here on your screen. So uh, so I have been playing chess for over 14 years. And I have competed in various national and international tournaments. And also, I have been coaching for the past 4.5 years or so. And I have experience teaching both adults as well as kids. So my students range from all the way as young as 5 years old to as old as 80 years old. Uh, and yeah, that's pretty much all I will mention right here in the beginning. And I think my profile is shared in the chat if you would like to take a peek while we are talking. Feel free to do so. So if I can ask everyone to type in what level you are at, if you consider yourself to be a total beginner or intermediate, or maybe you are an advanced player, go ahead and type in your level. Or if you have a rating of any kind, maybe you have played some tournaments or you are playing online. So yeah, Lakshmi, I see you're a beginner. Anybody else? Also, yeah, if you would like to tell me how many years or months or even weeks you have been playing the game, uh, let me know that as well. So that'll help me adjust my content a little bit to the level that all of you are at. Okay, so Thomas, you are beginner to intermediate. Okay, that makes sense. And if you have a rating, have you ever played in a tournament or do you play online on, many forums, chess.com, Chess, anything like that? Any of you play online? So I think, okay, we'll get started. So seems like most of you are at the beginner to intermediate level. So this should be helpful for all of you. So, okay, so my goal with this lesson is to share something that you can apply right away uh, in your games, okay? So, yeah, Thomas, you just mentioned, yeah, your rating was around 1575. So I will consider you intermediate, not really a beginner. But this should be helpful for you as well. But you may already be doing some of those and these things, the do's and avoiding the don'ts. But if you're not, hopefully I can show you some ways to think that you can use in your games. Okay, so yeah, the topic for today is chess opening principles for beginners. So especially helpful for beginner players, but I have seen players all the way up to 1800 rating. So even advanced players make some of these mistakes. And these are mistakes right in the beginning, so the opening stage of the game. So when we are starting the game, there are certain principles we want to be following if we want to have a good game ahead of us. And if we violate those principles, then what ends up happening is we lose a lot of games and you may not be sure why you are losing those games, but you may be making some fundamental errors. Okay. So what are the do's? What are the things that you should be doing? So these three tasks under do's. So control the center, develop all your pieces. So for those of you, if you're not aware, develop, the word develop in terms of chess simply means bring your pieces out. Okay. So I will talk more once we show you the chessboard. Third thing is castle. So castling is a special move in chess that is used to protect the king. And in the don'ts are what we will focus mostly on because these are the mistakes that I see a lot of the beginner students make. And you would want to not make these in your games. So first thing is in the opening, if you have already developed a piece, let's say you have brought out a knight, you would want to make sure you don't want to move the same piece over and over again. Okay. You want to bring all your pieces out quickly. Next one is you do not want to block your bishops because bishops are long range pieces that travel along diagonals. So if you block them with your own pieces or pawns, then you will hinder their movement and that will affect your game in a bad way. Okay. Third one, it's basically referring to the same principle. Do not leave any pieces unused. So make sure you are using all your pieces. Don't play without a rook or a knight or don't play with just a fraction of your pieces. Use all the pieces that you have. Then do not make unnecessary pawn moves. This is another common beginner error. A lot of pawn moves on the side of the board are made often. And many times these moves do not really have any, reason to be played. And the final one we will look at is, there are many opening systems that are popular: London system, Poli system, any kind of setup that you may learn as a beginner. And when we learn these setups, we feel very powerful. We feel that, okay, now we have something that I can just play every time, no matter what my opponent does. And that is not the case. So what I'm going to do now, I'm sure you have been wondering, when is the chess going to begin? So I'm going to share my chessboard. And hopefully you all can see the chessboard. If somebody can confirm that the chessboard is visible in the chat. Are you all able to see the chessboard? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I see a lot of yeses coming in. Okay, so let's look at the first principle, okay? So controlling the center. So what is the center? The center is basically these four squares right in the middle of the board. So when you are starting the game, you would want to make sure that you are bringing pawns and pieces out in such a way that you are controlling this middle part of the board. Now, the reason that is important is if you, let's say, concentrate your pieces all in one certain part of the board, let's say on this corner or all on the right side here, then if the action suddenly begins at a certain other part of the board, your pieces will have a tough time getting there. But pieces that are close to the center will have an easier time getting to wherever they are required. Okay, so let's see specifically what you should be doing. So I would say when you are starting out, you want to play a pawn move to one of these two squares if you're white, and same goes if you're black. Play a pawn move and try to control the center. So e4 right here would be a good pawn move. Now let's see what all it does. What are the good things it does? Firstly, we see we have occupied one of the centered squares with a pawn, and the pawn is controlling the d5 and f5 squares. So by the way, if you're not familiar with the square names that I'm mentioning, so you can see at the bottom of my board, there is letters A, B, C, D up until H. And on the left side, you can see 1, 2, 3 up until 8. And these two combined make up the square names. So I'll quickly give a tutorial on how this works. So for example, this one, this square that I've highlighted, this would be called C4. The reason being, this is on the C file and 4. So you see, we start with the letter and the number, and that combined together forms the name of the square. So this allows us to name every single square on the chessboard, okay? And we will be using that, especially when I ask you a question. And if you want to answer, just write down something like, pawn to c4 in your chat, or, knight to f3. So basically just write down which piece you would like to move and where, and use this system of squares. So for example, this one is f4. You see it's on the f line, and on the left side, it's on the fourth line. So f and 4, f4, okay? So, okay, with that out of the way, let's get started. So what I was saying is e4 is a good move. Now, what are the virtues? What are the good things it does? Is it occupies the central square, controls two squares in the opponent's territory. Also, d5, notice, is a central square. And it makes way for two of your pieces to get out. So the queen and bishop can now move out. Earlier, notice, none of these pieces could move. Only the knights can move in the starting position, right? So this move has a lot of benefits. We are controlling the center and we are helping us develop pieces, okay? Now, let's say our opponent plays a bad move. Let's say black plays the move h6, pawn to h6. Now, the reason this is a bad move is because it is not following any of the opening principles. So is this move in the center? No. And is this helping black bring out any of his pieces? No. The rook may come to h7, but what is this rook doing on h7, right? So when an opponent plays a move like this, then we should immediately grab the opportunity to put two pawns in the middle, side by side, on e4 and d4. Now, I want to stress the word immediately. So we want to play d4 immediately. So right here, d4 would be a very good move. Now, white has domination over the whole center. So if I again highlight some squares, you see the d4 square, sorry, the d4 pawn controls c5 and e5. Also, the e4 pawn controls e5 and f5. Now, notice by playing these two moves, by playing these two pawns side by side, we are controlling 4 squares in black's half of the board. So if I quickly draw a line here like that, so you can hopefully see the green line. So below the green line is white's half, and above the green line is black's half. And we are controlling squares in our opponent's half of the board simply by putting 2 pawns side by side. Okay, so playing 2 pawns in the center side by side like that, if you are allowed, you should do so immediately. Okay, now again, I said immediately. Now, why is that so? Why can't we wait? So let me explain. So let's say you wait, you decide, okay, I mean, I'm going to do something useful. I'm going to bring my knight out. Oops. Now, what's the problem with that? I'm going to play d4 next move or whenever I want. Now, the problem is black can prevent you from establishing 2 pawns in the center with a move like c5. So black puts a pawn. Now black himself is controlling this square. And now if you play d4, he can capture. Yes, you get your pawn back, but did white get to put 2 pawns in the center? No. The reason he did not is because he waited. You waited a move. You played the knight f3 before playing d4. So whenever you get a chance to put 2 pawns in the middle, do so immediately. Okay, so that is the first part of the opening that you should focus on. And this is valid for white or black. If you're playing black, same thing. If I flip the board very quickly, let's say your opponent starts with a move that doesn't control the center, go ahead and put a pawn in the middle. Let's say he does something else which also doesn't control the center, go ahead and put 2 pawns in the middle. And now you see, even you are black, you achieve the same thing. Okay, so that is about controlling the center, and we will go to the next part of the next point that I had shown on the presentation. So let's see. Okay. Now the next part is develop quickly and castle. So those were the do's. So we are still talking about the do's in the presentation. So develop quickly. What does that mean? So the game of chess, it symbolizes a war. Okay, so it symbolizes a war between two armies. So there is the white army, and these are all our forces. The pawns, the pieces. These are our soldiers. And there is the black army. And you can think of this area, the middle area, as the battlefield. Okay, so and this back here is home. This is home base. This is where the soldiers, let's say, sleep. So we want to make sure in the start of the battle, in the start of the game, that we bring out all our soldiers and get them involved in the battle, get them into the battlefield. Okay, now that's what the opening principle, develop your pieces, means. So get all the pieces out quickly so that they are fighting. They are not just sitting home being useless. Okay, so now let's see how to do that effectively. Now, what's the ideal order, and what will be the right way to do that? So again, as I mentioned, this move e4 is good. You can also start with d4, by the way, but if you are a total beginner, I recommend starting with e4. It will give you the type of game that will help you, okay, learn. So now let's again see that, let's say what happens if black plays bad moves again. We have seen this move before. It's bad, not in the center. So we know we should control the center with 2 pawns in the middle, right? e4 and d4. What next? Let's say black decides, okay, I'm going to just push pawns throughout the game. I don't think that'll harm me. So how should white continue here? So we know the principle of bringing our pieces out. Now, when I say pieces, I do not mean the pawns. In the very beginning, we pushed the pawns because we needed to push the pawns to bring our pieces out. As I mentioned before, if I do not move any pawns, the only pieces that can ever move are the knights. The other pieces cannot come out. So to facilitate my pieces to come out, I need to move pawns. So I did that, and I control the center. But now it's time to bring the pieces out. So which pieces should come first? Not your queen. The first pieces that you should bring out are the knights and the bishops. Okay, both the knights and both the bishops. So remember this. Bring out the knights and the bishops first, and the knights before bishops. Okay. Now, why knights before bishops? Because if you see in this very position, the bishop is already having some influence. Both the bishops are having some influence in the opponent's territory, right? This bishop, for example, could capture on h6. It's not a good idea, but it could. Similarly, the f1 bishop, is controlling some squares in black's half. But are the knights doing that? Can we say that about these two knights? No. So the knights are short range pieces, right? They can only hop around so much at a time. So they cannot travel far. They cannot have an influence on a distant part of the board from where they are. So that's why we want to activate them first so that they can get involved, because the bishop are already doing something just by being opened. Okay. So knight f3 would be a good move. Just bringing pieces out. Let's say black continues his policy of pushing pawns. Bishop c4. Now notice I'm trying to develop my pieces to active squares. What do I mean by active? All I mean is where my pieces will have more possibilities, where they could do more. Okay, so if we see this bishop on f1, right now it can go in this diagonal. Great. Now look what happens when I put it on c4. Suddenly it can travel along this diagonal. Oops. Along this diagonal, which it could not do back on f1. So, but it can also still do what it was doing, which is travel along this diagonal. It can retreat and come back this way. So the bishop increased its scope. It can do more stuff. It can go to more squares by being here. So that's what we mean by active. So you want to develop your pieces to active squares, as active as possible. Okay. So bishop c4. Let's say black continues pushing his pawns. e6. Now, what would be the next move if you take a guess? Again, we are trying to bring the knights and the bishops out. Knight c3. You could also castle, by the way. I'm sure some of you may be wondering, can we not castle? Yes, you can castle. So the point is, develop the knights and bishops and castle. Those are the first things you want to do. You don't want to move the queen, and we don't want to push any pawns unless needed. We have pushed the 2 pawns that we wanted to push because these 2 pawns are helping our bishops come out. No other pawns are required for the rest of our pieces to come out, so we won't push them. Okay, get your fighters, the strong fighters, out first. So what are the stronger forces that you have? Like pieces are stronger or pawns are stronger? Obviously the pieces are stronger, right? Your pieces can travel further, faster, so you want to bring them out first. Okay, so knight c3, continuing development. Bishop e3. Now what has happened in these 6 moves? White has controlled the center, and he has brought his pieces out to very active squares. So both the knights and both the bishops. Okay. Let's say black continues pushing pawns. What comes next? Now we castle. Okay. We castle to protect the king. Now, I'm sure some of you who have studied some chess online or however, have heard that, okay, castling protects the king. Can anybody tell me in the chat, how exactly does castling protect the king? If you can type an answer, go ahead. How does castling help protect the king? So, what about castling is protecting the king? Who is protecting the king right here? Can anybody type the answer? So is it the rook that's protecting? Is it someone else? Who exactly is protecting the king once the king is castled? The pawns, yes, very good, Thomas, yes. So these 3 pawns in front of the king, excuse me, are protecting the king. Now notice back here on e1, we were pushing these pawns, right? We pushed this e4 pawn. And if we keep the king in the center too long, eventually the center will be open and the king will be vulnerable, okay? So that's why we castle, and so that these 3 pawns can shield the king. Okay, so that is the point of castling. Also, it has a side benefit of, this rook in the corner wasn't doing much. Now it has more possibilities. It could get involved in the game somehow. Okay, so it activates one of the rooks, but mainly it protects the king by covering it with these 3 pawns. So that also means that when you have castled, you don't want these pawns to be compromised. So now playing g4 and h4 and pushing all these pawns would not be a good idea, because then that loses the point of castling, right? Okay, so let's keep going. Let's say black pushes another pawn. What do we do next? We have castled, we have brought our knights and bishops out. Next, we should be thinking about the rest of our pieces, the queens and the rooks. Sorry, the queen and the rooks. Okay, so next, just move your queen, and this develops the queen and it connects the rooks. So the rooks are able to see each other. And the rooks usually like to work together in games. So your rooks being able to see each other is important. Now, what next? Let's say black keeps pushing pawns. Next, you want your rooks to be useful. So bring them to the center. Okay. And now you would say, okay, what is this rook doing on d1? I don't understand. Well, what we are going to do now next is we are going to open the position with a pawn break. So I have another example. Let's look at that. Now, this time, uh, let's say black plays a little better. Okay. Black does not play, just push pawns and not control the center. Let's say black plays better. Black also is aware of the opening principles, and black will play a better game. So now, same thing, the principles don't change. Doesn't matter how your opponent plays. So we develop the pieces, starting with the knight. We are attacking this pawn, this e5 pawn. The knight could capture. So black needs to protect. We bring the bishop out. Again, developing pieces. Black also is doing the same thing. He brings his knight out, attacking our e4 pawn. We bring our knight out, protecting. So we are combining the development. We are combining the bringing out of pieces along with managing any threats that our opponent makes. So for example, here, the knight is attacking the pawn, and we didn't want to, make a move like this, because that will move the same bishop again, which already was developed. It's much better, much more effective for our game to bring another piece into the game and protect the pawn. Okay, so let's say black continues developing a bit passively with his bishop on e7. We played d3. Why are we pushing this pawn? The reason is we want to get the bishop out. And notice one thing, if I go all the way back, right here, we didn't play the other pawn to the middle. The reason is, if we had played, we would not be able to establish two pawns in the center anyway. We only get one pawn in the center. So we can recapture, but then black makes a useful move and attacks our queen. But we have to spend one move just reacting to black's threat. We did not accomplish anything. We move our queen wherever we do. But this move was not part of our plans. So that's why playing d4 back here is not a good idea. Okay, so knight f3, let's go back. Knight c3, developing another piece, protecting the pawn. Black is also developing. Now we push the d pawn to get the other bishop out, and we get the other bishop out. Now we have developed, white has developed the knights and the bishops, both the knights and the bishops. We know the next step, we castle. Okay. Now, if you follow these steps, this may look very simple, but I can guarantee you, if you follow this consistently in your games, you will get a good game. Okay. So next, developing the queen, bringing the rook, and now the point that I was making, d4. Now d4 is called a pawn break. Now this is a particular type of move. Why are we pushing this pawn right now? Because our rooks need some open files. Okay. So what are files? The vertical lines on a chessboard are called files. And our rooks, as long as everything is closed, our rooks really cannot do anything. Our rooks are not able to, attack anything in the opponent's camp. So the way our rooks will become active and be able to do something is if we can break open some files. Now, in order to break open some files, we need to trade some pawns, because you see, it's pawns that are keeping the position closed. So that's why a move like d4, what we are doing, we are trying to attack his pawn with our pawn. Now, one of two things will happen. At some point, either white can capture, and that will, you see, whenever this happens, you see, let me show you actually. So let's say black captures. Oops. Let's say black does not capture. Black makes this move, and you capture, he captures. Now look what happened. This d file suddenly became open. Now, does the rook on d1 look more effective? Yes. The queen can step outside, and suddenly let's say I'll just make some moves just to illustrate. Now, let's say queen moves aside. Now you can see this rook is very useful on the open file. It's actually doing something. It can actually go up, it has some possibilities, and it's possible for white to even bring the other rook behind this rook, right? So all this happened. The reason our rooks became active is because we played this pawn break. So pawn breaks are essential if we want to activate all of our pieces. Okay. So now let's go to the next point that we had talked about in the PowerPoint presentation. So, and also any questions, by the way, everyone, go ahead and type in your questions in the Q&A box if you have any, but I'll keep moving. So the next point, now we are coming to the don'ts part of the presentation. So the do's we have covered. Control the center, develop your pieces quickly, and castle the king. And we learned how to do that in a very effective way, and which you can use in your games, starting with right now. Like once you are done with this lesson, play a game, use these principles, okay? Now, coming to the don'ts, the mistakes that you should avoid. So we should not be moving the same piece over and over again. Now let's see an example. So again, let's say white plays, we have seen this opening before, so I will not give too much commentary. Now, black played this move d6. Can anybody tell me what might be a little downside of this move? What might be wrong about this move? In the chat, type in, there is one piece of blacks that is not very happy. So one of the do's, one of the don'ts was don't block your bishops. So which bishop is being blocked by this pawn? It's this bishop, the f8 bishop, right? So if you notice, right now, this bishop can go all the way up to here, a3. But now, once the bishop is, once the pawn is pushed, the bishop gets blocked and restricted, okay? So these are things that we should avoid. Now, d6 is not a bad move. It's not a terrible move, but it definitely affects black's bishop, this bishop in particular, from being active, okay? Fine. So white will not make any such mistakes. So he is developing his pieces very effectively and actively. Now black makes another mistake. He blocks his other bishop with his queen. Now we have learned that we shouldn't move the queen out too early. When should we move the queen? Only after we have castled and already brought out our knights and bishops. So black has made, you can say, two mistakes. He's blocking both his bishops to some extent, this one by the pawn, the other one by the queen, and he's developing his queen too early. Now let's see if this has any effect on the game later on. So white will continue following the principles. So white castles, black brings his other knight out. White plays pawn to d3. Why? Again, we want to get this other bishop out. So, we have to think about our pieces. Now, you see, if white had started playing with his rooks or queen, this bishop will stay locked in forever. And that may also mean this rook will stay locked in forever. And you would be playing the game without two of your pieces, essentially. So that's what we want to avoid. Okay, so pawn to d3, knight b4. Now, this is a typical error. Why? Because this knight on c6 was already developed, right? This knight is already in the battlefield. So why do we need to move it again? Does this accomplish anything? No. So, white doesn't worry about the knight, just continues developing. Now, notice what has happened. How many pieces has black developed? How many pieces are not on the back rank? So, 3, or rather, I'll make them red. 3 for black. And how many, what about white? 1, 2, 3, 4, plus white has also castled. So I can say, even the king and the rook are developed. So because the king used to be back on e1. So all these pieces have moved for white, but black has only moved 3 pieces. And black is wasting more time by moving his knight around, okay? So now he moves the other knight. Now, was the knight not developed already on f6? Yes, it was. So moving the other knight, he may think, okay, I'm attacking your bishop. So, I'm doing something great. But no, this is a time-wasting move. So these are the kind of mistakes, if you are making them, you should avoid, okay? So queen d2, white is simply, following the protocol, White thinks, okay, I have developed my knights and bishops, king is castled, next my queen needs to come out, queen d2. And black says, okay, I think I'm getting something. I'm going to capture your bishop. Now notice that we need to pay attention to our opponent's threats. So taking with the queen will be a mistake here. Can anybody tell me why? Can anybody type a move and tell me what black could do if white captures the knight with his queen? There is a move that black could do which will hurt white quite a bit. So queen takes knight will lead to knight takes c2, and suddenly both the queen and the rook are attacked, and one of them will be lost. Okay, so that's why now white is alert. We are alert, and we should be alert. We should be knowing, keeping an awareness about what our opponents are trying to do. So white recaptures with the pawn uh, this way, and everything is great. Now look again. How many pieces does black have developed? Two. How many does white have developed? One, two, three, four. Five. You see this rook is now open, right? So white is way ahead. Why? Because white did not waste time moving the same pieces over and over again as black did. Now you would think, okay, well, I don't see why this is a big deal. So now black continues. Black says, okay, it's time to castle. Now there is in fact a winning move for white. White comes up with the brilliant move. Bishop takes f7, check. Now what's so great about it? After black captures, he has knight takes e5, check, and now see what kind of havoc white's active pieces are having on the wrecking on the black's position. So it's a check by the rook, it's a check by the knight. So this is a double check, and the knight is attacking the queen. So when the king moves, the queen will be lost, and all this happened simply because white's pieces were very, very active. Yes, Bonita, yeah, you are correct. It's a fork. Yes. It's a fork and also a discovered attack, actually, this tactic. So uh, the rook is, the knight moving discovers or uncovers an attack of the rook on the king, as well as, it's a fork between the queen and the king. So, but the larger point is, why did white have this brilliant tactic so early in the game? Simply because all his pieces are active while blacks are not. You know, what did I say in the very beginning? This is a war and you need to get your soldiers out. Now, if you get more soldiers into the battlefield before your opponent does, eventually you will have chances to strike. And we see an example. Okay, so let's go back. Did I have anything else here? Okay, yeah. So another example here. So I talked about blocking bishops. We should be aware of our bishops and make sure we are not blocking them. So let's see another example where white is doing some self damage. So he starts off with e3. Already not a good move, right? I mean, it's not terrible. It helps the bishop and queen to come out, but we could have been more ambitious and gone over to e4. Let's say black is playing correctly. I'll flip the board. And white plays d3. Now, you see what's happened to the bishops? These two bishops are very, very unhappy. They're like, my view of the outside world has been blocked. I have been caged in by my own pawns, which I cannot even capture. So, okay, but black is following all the principles we talked about, controlling the center, developing actively. So I'm not giving too much commentary on these moves since we already have seen such stuff. But just look at the picture. These two bishops. This e2 bishop, the highlighted bishop, literally cannot move. Doesn't have a single move. Why? Because white blocked it in, voluntarily. He did this to himself. This bishop, where can it go? The d2 bishop, only back. And if I flip the board, notice, think about how you feel in this position. What about the queen? Can it do anything? No. So white is very restricted simply because he has placed his pawns in this way. So the lesson to learn is pay attention to how your pawns are affecting your pieces. Okay, because pawns are like the skeleton in the chessboard. So they define the roads for your pieces. So right now, you block the roads for your bishops, and your whole position is very unhappy. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so the next point was we don't want to make too many pawn moves. Okay, So let's see some examples of what kind of pawn moves do beginners make, and we want to avoid them if we want to, become better. So okay, we have seen these moves. Now this a3 move, is this helping anybody? Is this controlling the center or developing any piece? No, but many players will reason that, oh, I don't want, oops, sorry, I don't want a knight to come here someday. I don't want a bishop to come here someday. So I am preventing these, I'm by playing a3. But this is not something that has to be prevented. So that's why, these pawn moves are a waste of time. And as we know, we should be prioritizing getting our pieces out. So instead of a3, you would be much better, just bringing a knight or a bishop out. Okay, so let's see what happens. a3, um, black does the right thing. Black just gets his pieces out. Knight f3, attacking the pawn now. White brings the other knight out and defends. Black brings his bishop to this very nice active diagonal on c5. And now white sees another ghost. White is like, oh, I think what he's trying to do is come knight g4, and then he can take on f2. And suddenly, a knight on f2 will be attacking my queen and rook both. So clearly, I need to prevent this, right? So h3. Now, h3 is another pawn move which didn't help any pieces. Now, was this necessary? Can anyone tell me a better way that white could have avoided this threat? It is indeed a threat, knight to g4, if allowed, and if black is allowed to take on f2, then white could be in a lot of trouble. So how can we avoid that? Anybody in the chat? So white can simply develop, actually. So bishop c4, just get your pieces out. Now you may ask, okay, well, what if black goes ahead and plays this, dreaded knight g4 move? Well, you just castle, which is anyway part of our plan. Castle, and now notice your king and rook are defending this pawn, and you have not only avoided useless pawn moves, you have got two of your pieces out, and you have gotten castle. And if black wants to take, you just take back. So what has happened is you have black has given up two of their pieces, meaning the knight and the bishop, for a rook and a pawn, which, if you know the point system, is roughly equal value. So 3 points for the bishop and knight each, and rook is 5 points, the pawn is 1 point. So 6 points for 6 points. But the two pieces in practical play are a little more valuable. So black went through all these contortions, and white just got his pieces out, and black got nothing. Okay. So again, so moves like h3 you want to avoid. Moves like a3 you want to avoid. As I'm not saying never play these, but we should play them only when they are absolutely necessary. Okay. Okay. Now let's see another point that was back on the slide. Avoid playing a system mindlessly. Now, many of you may be aware of different opening systems like London system, Poly system, maybe some other system. Okay. Now the systems, knowing the systems are good. So because it gives you a structure, a certain set of moves, or a setup that you can play against everything, and that's very good to have. But an opening system cannot replace thinking for yourself and paying attention to your opponent. So let's see an example of where playing an opening system mindlessly leads white to trouble. Okay, so this time we are starting with d4, and we are going to be seeing an example of the famous London system opening. If you do not know this, you can Google, but I'll also show it to you. So it's a good system. You bring the knight out to f3, bring the bishop out to f4, and then white will push his pawns on e3 and c3, bring the other bishop to d3, and get the knight to d2. So that is the basic London system setup. Okay, remove the arrows. Now let's see. Okay, now black continues developing, and black plays this move. Sorry, white plays this move, knight b to d2. Now what is wrong with this, you think? Can anybody tell me? Now black can make a move which puts white in a big trouble. Can anybody suggest a good move for black? So if you want to, just type out the name of the piece and which square you think the piece should go to. Thomas, I know you're 1575. Do you see a good move here for black? How can black cause some trouble to white? So the answer is knight to b4. So simply threatening this pawn, now the bishop and the knight are both looking at it. And if allowed to capture, that will be a fork between the rook and the king. So white is in a lot of trouble. Now, what can he do? He can try rook c1, but then this a2 pawn falls. Black gets a free pawn and attacks the rook. Rook goes back, king comes back. So black managed to take a pawn, and this threat has not gone away. So white should have noticed that, okay, knight to c6 has the threat of knight to b4. So what should white do instead? Instead of mindlessly playing knight b to d2, which he might have planned, excuse me, ahead of time, he can play c3, because this is also part of the London system. Now there is no knight to b4, and this threat is stopped. And next, this pawn can be pushed to e3, the bishop can come out to d3, and white can go ahead and follow their system. But while following a system, we want to make sure that we are paying attention to our opponent's threats and not doing it mindlessly, not playing some opening system mindlessly. Okay, so that was all the examples I wanted to talk about. Any questions anyone has about any of the material that I shared, any of the opening principles or examples or anything? And also, yeah, while you are here, if you liked what I shared, if you learned something, go ahead and use it in your games. I'm sure if you use these principles consistently, you will win a lot more and you will avoid common errors.